A country tearing itself apart, brothers killing brothers. A former empire collapsing into chaos, with a dozen different armies fighting for a dozen different visions of the future. This is the story of the Russian Civil War, a conflict so brutal and so chaotic that it left between 7 and 12 million people dead, most of them civilians who simply got caught in the crossfire of history. This was the war that decided whether Russia would become a communist state, and in many ways it shaped the entire course of the 20th century. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a like if you want more deep dives into history that shaped the modern world. And I genuinely want to know, where are you watching this from tonight? Drop your country in the comments, I read every single one. Let's rewind to 1917, when an empire that had stood for centuries suddenly collapsed almost overnight. By early 1917, Russia was already crumbling. Years of brutal fighting in World War I had drained the country of resources, food, and morale. Millions of Russian soldiers had died on the Eastern Front, and back home, people were starving in the streets while the aristocracy lived in relative comfort. In February 1917, mass protests and strikes erupted in the capital, Petrograd. Soldiers, ordered to fire on their own people, instead turned their guns away and joined the protesters. Within days, Tsar Nicholas II, ruler of Russia for over 2 decades, was forced to abdicate the throne entirely, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. A provisional government took power, promising democracy and reform. But it was weak, disorganized, and deeply unpopular, especially because it chose to keep Russia fighting in World War I, despite the immense suffering this caused ordinary citizens. Into this chaos stepped Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik party, a radical communist faction promising peace, land, and bread to the exhausted population. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks staged a swift and decisive coup, seizing key government buildings in Petrograd almost without resistance, and declaring the establishment of a new Soviet government. Many assumed this would simply be another temporary shift in power. They were catastrophically wrong. The Bolshevik seizure of power did not go unchallenged. Almost immediately, opposition forces began forming across the vast territory of the former Russian Empire. These anti-Bolshevik forces became known collectively as the Whites, though in reality they were a fractured coalition of monarchists, moderate socialists, Democrats, and former Tsarist military officers who often distrusted each other almost as much as they distrusted the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks, meanwhile, became known as the Reds, and they quickly organized a formidable fighting force called the Red Army, led by the brilliant and ruthless military strategist Leon Trotsky. By 1918, full-scale civil war had erupted across Russia. Fighting raged from the western borders all the way to Siberia in the east. Foreign powers, including Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, even intervened militarily, sending troops and supplies to support the White forces, fearing the spread of communism across the world. The war became defined by shifting front lines, brutal atrocities committed by both sides, and a population caught helplessly in the middle. Villages were burned. Grain was forcibly seized from starving peasants to feed soldiers. Executions without trial became common practice on both sides of the conflict. Adding even more chaos to the picture, a third major faction emerged as well, known as the Greens, made up largely of peasant militias who fought against both the Reds and the Whites, simply trying to protect their own villages and land from being looted by whichever army happened to pass through. There was also the Ukrainian anarchist movement led by Nestor Makhno, which controlled significant territory and fought fiercely against multiple sides throughout the conflict. This was never a simple two-sided war. It was a sprawling, multi-sided collapse of an entire civilization. If this story is already gripping you, make sure to smash that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more curious minds. As the war intensified, the Bolshevik government launched what became known as the Red Terror, a campaign of mass repression aimed at crushing any and all opposition to communist rule. The secret police, known as the Cheka, arrested, tortured, and executed suspected enemies of the revolution, often with little to no evidence or formal trial. Estimates suggest tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people were killed during this campaign of terror, including former nobles, clergy, business owners, and anyone even suspected of sympathizing with the White forces or opposing Bolshevik policies. The White forces committed their own brutal atrocities in response, executing suspected communists and their sympathizers in equally horrifying numbers. Pogroms against Jewish communities also erupted across the country during this period, carried out by various factions, adding yet another horrific layer of violence to an already catastrophic conflict. Meanwhile, In July 1918, Tsar Nicholas II and his entire family were executed by Bolshevik forces in the city of Yekaterinburg, a brutal act meant to eliminate any possibility of a monarchist restoration and symbolically end the old regime forever. The war was no longer simply a political struggle. It had become a nationwide bloodbath, consuming millions of ordinary lives. As the fighting dragged on into 1920 and 1921, the war brought unimaginable suffering to the Russian population beyond the battlefield itself. Agricultural production collapsed as farmland was destroyed, livestock slaughtered, and millions of men pulled away from their fields to fight. A devastating famine swept across the Volga region and other parts of Russia, killing an estimated 5 million people from starvation and related diseases, a horrifying humanitarian catastrophe compounding the war's already staggering death toll. International relief efforts, including aid from the American Relief Administration, helped save countless lives, but millions still perished. Disease also ravaged the exhausted population. Typhus, cholera, and other epidemics spread rapidly through refugee camps, military units, and starving villages, killing potentially millions more people who had already survived years of brutal fighting. Economically, the entire country was in ruins. Industrial production had collapsed to a fraction of pre-war levels. Cities emptied as starving residents fled to the countryside, searching desperately for food. The once mighty Russian Empire had been reduced to smoking rubble and mass graves within just a few short years. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you're learning something new today. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these important stories. Despite facing enemies on nearly every front, foreign intervention, and catastrophic internal chaos, the Red Army gradually gained the upper hand as the war progressed. Trotsky's organizational genius, combined with the Bolsheviks' control over Russia's industrial heartland and railway networks, allowed the Reds to move troops and supplies far more efficiently than their scattered white opponents. The white forces, meanwhile, remained deeply divided, lacking unified leadership or a coherent political vision beyond simply opposing communism. Foreign support from Western powers, while significant, was inconsistent and ultimately insufficient to turn the tide decisively in the whites' favor. By 1920, most major white armies had been decisively defeated across European Russia. Fighting continued sporadically in remote regions like Siberia and the Far East for a couple more years, but the outcome of the war was effectively already decided. In 1922, the last significant white resistance collapsed, and the Bolsheviks formally established the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, cementing communist control over the vast territory of the former Russian Empire. Millions of white sympathizers, aristocrats, and their families fled the country entirely, creating a massive wave of Russian émigrés who scattered across Europe, China, and beyond, forever severed from their homeland. The Russian Civil War left between 7 and 12 million people dead, a staggering toll that includes soldiers, civilians, famine victims, and disease casualties across this brutal multi-year conflict. It fundamentally reshaped Russia, establishing the Soviet Union as a communist superpower that would go on to influence global politics for the next 70 years. The war's brutality, the atrocities committed by all sides, and the immense suffering endured by ordinary Russian citizens remain a haunting reminder of how quickly a nation can descend into chaos when a fragile government collapses under pressure. And in many ways, the trauma of these years, the famine, the terror, and the total breakdown of order, helped shape the paranoid, iron-fisted style of governance that would come to define the Soviet Union for decades afterward, right up through the rule of Joseph Stalin himself. If you learned something today, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and follow this channel for more forgotten history from around the world. And once again, tell me in the comments, what country are you watching this from tonight? I love seeing how far these stories reach around the globe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.